Hello, I'm Linda Everhart, and I'm here this afternoon with my good friend Ann Labounsky. Ann is not just a distinguished performer, but distinguished teacher, head of the organ department at Duquesne University, and scholar and teacher extraordinaire. So we have a lot of opportunity to, a lot of territory we can cover. And, excuse me, I think I've known Anne for more than 30 years. And in those 30 years, I, I have noticed her to be a person with exceptional humility. You will never hear her name dropping or impressing you with the people she has known or worked with. But let me tell you, if she did, she would really have quite a bit to drop on you because she has known and worked with so many extraordinary musicians in her lifetime. And so, in this little bit of time that we have today to talk together on behalf of the Oregon Historical Society, I wanted to talk with Anne about teaching, Oregon pedagogy, and about some of the great teachers she has experienced, what she has derived from her experience with them, and how she in turn has incorporated that into her philosophy of teaching. So, to begin with, and I'm going to ask you to roll back the clock to your first organ lesson, which I think was with Paul Stifler. Stifler. Can you tell us a little bit about how you came to study with him and the influence he's had on your career?
Yeah, with great pleasure. So, excuse me, I was born in New York City. And when I was 4 years old, oh, actually, this is an interesting coincidence. I was baptized at Riverside Church because we lived on Riverside Drive. And then we moved. Then we moved to Greenvale, first at Port Washington, then Greenvale, and then finally Oyster Bay when I was 10 years old. And so I was studying piano from the age of 6, and, this is a funny story how this happened. You know about the Masons.
Yeah.
Well, the Masons and their wives are the, Eastern Star, and their daughters are the Triangle Girls, so I was a Triangle Girl, and, they asked me if I would play for the installation of the De Molay chapter there. And, it was a Hammond organ, I remember that. I had never played the organ, but I thought, "Well, I guess I could do something." So I tried, and that was fun. And so then I thought, "Well, maybe I'll take a few organ lessons." And, it's funny how things kind of align as I look back on it. I had been studying, piano with, I was a member at Christ Church, Oyster Bay, and the, organist I was studying piano with, and then, Paul Seifler came, and I thought, "Well, I could take some organ lessons from him." I remember it was in the summer. It was very hot, and I laugh about this because I was wearing shorts, and I was wearing sneakers, and what I imagined that an organist would do is that you would just use your left foot for the pedals, and then your right foot, you'd use that for, the swell box. So he said, "No," and he said, "No, no, no, you have to use both feet for the pedal." And so that's how that started, and then I just loved the organ, and so I took, let's see, I was a junior in high school then, and, so I started taking organ lessons from him, and I also took piano lessons from his partner, John LaMontagne, in New York City. So I would take the train from Oyster Bay, the Long Island Railroad, all the way into New York. I don't know how I did that every week. Their apartment was on West 57th Street. So I'm remembering, those studying piano with John LaMontagne was just as important as studying organ with Paul Seifler.
Why? Why was that?
Because of his, he understood. the technique of playing the piano, which was based on Tobias Natte, which I had never heard of him, but using that technique for relaxation, made a big difference in my playing both in organ and in piano. So that's how that worked.
Well, that must have been kind of extraordinary because if you started with them when you were a junior, by your senior year, you were getting accepted to the Eastman School of Music. That's pretty meteoric rise of a young organist. Did Seifler encourage you to apply to Eastman?
No, actually, it was John LaMontagne
Montaigne.
because he had studied there.
Oh,
And so, I learned from both of them, at the same time. And, they both had a very, very important influence in my life.
right, right. Yeah, that's interesting about the relaxation technique.
Yeah, this is very important. And it's interesting because we had Wilma Jensen, who's 95 years old. She what an amazing woman. And she was living here for 2 weeks, and she she wrote a book on technique, and that's one of the things that she talked about in her book too.
hmm But uh, but I'm glad you mentioned that. That's interesting. Okay, now we've been on one mountaintop. Let's leap over to the next mountaintop and talk about your teacher at Eastman. And the the thing that occurred to me as I was looking at that, thinking when you met David Craighead, that he was a young guy then. I only have known him, only knew him as a white-haired octogenarian, kind of a craggy guy. You knew the young David Craighead. What was he like
Well,
when you met him?
yes, so he had been teaching at Eastman for only 3 years at that time, and he was at the height of his performing career, and he was very shy, actually, and so, it's wonderful to have known a person that long. So I knew him as a young teacher, and then I knew him, at the end of his life when I would have him come to Duquesne to teach. And he was also, we became very close friends. He was the godfather of my youngest daughter. And, we just, our paths really stayed very much intertwined. He was a very fine performer. I don't know that he was a very great teacher at that time. He grew into becoming a great teacher as one does. I think he learned from his students as I have. When I first started to teach, I didn't know anything about how to teach it, but then, what I say is I think the reason that I stayed at Duquesne for 56 years, and I sometimes wonder, why did I do that? And I said, well, it's actually very simple. You listen to a student play and uh, you hear what could be better. And so you make a few suggestions. They try it, it gets better, and they feel indebted to you for life. Now, what's not to like about that?
That's right. Yeah, absolutely.
But I mean, it seems very simple, but I think that there are people who are born to do this, to teach. My grandmother lived with us, and she had that pedagogical sense, and my father did too. So I think even at a very early age, I had learned, from my family the idea of how you could help people by teaching them.
Well, when you landed at Eastman, I mean, as when you were at home studying, you were sort of in a universe of one yourself. Suddenly at Eastman, you're with all these other extremely talented organists.
Yeah.
How in a studio such as David Craighead maintained or you maintained, how do you keep from creating a pecking order and having all the students be nourished?
That is a big problem. And, I felt that when I went to Eastman, I looked up to those who who could play a lot better than I did. And I thought, I'll never be able to play like that. Robert Town was one of them, and there was another woman who was just marvelous. Can't think of her name now, but we there was you were exactly. I mean, I think that's how it. There's always a pecking order, and I felt that I was at the bottom of the pecking order. But I practiced hard, and I loved being there. And David Craighead was very kind. He was, at that time in his life, he was not. He had gone to Curtis, but he was not a seasoned teacher himself at that time. And so what he would do is, you play the piece and he'd say, well, you made a mistake in measure, whatever it was. And then later on in his life, he said, I changed. Then I knew I wasn't just there to point out where you made a mistake, but it was to change lives. And I've always felt that that was very beautiful. And then he did in his life as he grew into his maturity.
That should be embroidered on a tapestry, don't you think, of every music teacher? Then that's beautiful. Um, so after you graduated from Eastman, how did you make a decision to go west, young lady, to the University of Michigan?
Yeah, that was a hard decision to make because I had it actually I got a good a church job there. I there was an Episcopal church on Lake Avenue and a Church of the Ascension, and I enjoyed I enjoyed working there. But then I thought, no, I think it's good to change teachers and get another perspective. So I had heard about the University of Michigan and Marilyn Mason, the teacher there, and so I thought, well, why don't I just drive out there? I drove out with several other friends who were also they weren't organists, but no, they were thinking of going there. And I remember meeting Marilyn Mason for the first time and playing for her. And she said, "Oh, I'm so glad you decided to come to the University of Michigan." I always laugh about that. That's yeah, so that's how that worked. And that's where I met my husband. Uh I did it rather quickly because I had gotten a Fulbright grant to study in Paris.
So during the time you were with Marilyn Mason, I'm trying to think about that stage of your artistic development. You were certainly a competent performer, a competent player. You'd honed the rudiments of technique and so forth. What what were you gaining as an artist in that time with Mason? In what areas were you expanding and learning?
Well, she was a wonderful performer, and there was a the that had our lessons in Hill Auditorium on that very large concert instrument, which was, a great blessing to be able to have lessons on that instrument. Because at Eastman, we were in David Craighead's studio. It was, as I remember, it was a Holt Camp, three manual Holt Camp organ, but it didn't have the resources that the organ in Hill Auditorium had. And then it was partly because of the, being able to take lessons, not so much organ, but, to be able to study, well, Hans David was, that Bach scholar was teaching, so I studied with him, and Robert Nairn was there. I was so scared of him, but, he was, studied organ building with him. I could never I could never figure out the mathematics and the mix I just but he was someone I admired a great deal, and so, it was that exposure to other teachers, but not just organ, but so many other fields that I was interested in.
That issue you just raised about the organ in David Craighead's studio makes me think of a reality that organists and young organists face all the time. That is, they're they're playing Bach they are not playing on the Hildebrandt in Hamburg, and they're they're playing Langlais, but they're not playing on the Caballero San Clotilde. How do you work with a student to learn to adapt registration to an instrument that doesn't have the tonal resources really that, let's just say, the composer had in mind? How do you help them develop the instincts for working on the free manual in the studio in a situation like that?
Well, I think, we have a lot of advantages today, and even back in the 60s, with the sound recording, if you can listen to these instruments and you can hear, oh, that's how it sounds. And then you study organ building and you said, so we know Frank's organ had these stops on it, but uh, you can't just say because, you have these reeds, if you would use American reeds in that way, it would sound terrible. So you have to adapt, always adapt to the instrument. And that's what I was doing.
And that must be a continual area of growth for the organist. I mean, you're constantly adapting in every new situation.
Well, and then of course you have to adapt to a cat.
Yeah. Yeah. Adapt to that.
This is Romeo. He's in charge. He runs the house. We just live here.
So after the time with David Craighead at Eastman and then attaining a master's degree with Marilyn Mason, now you're making the big break and you've scored a Fulbright fellowship
Yeah.
to study in Paris. And now you're encountering the difference between, well, I'm assuming there's a significant difference between American organ pedagogy and French organ pedagogy. Uh, can you tell me how any of that struck you when you first jumped into that pond?
Well, here's the reason that I applied for a Fulbright. It wasn't to study with Langlais. I mean, I had wanted to study with Andre Marchal because I had heard him at Syracuse University and I had heard him also at Oberlin College. And when I heard him play, I knew that he understood things about how to phrase that other people didn't know. And I would do anything that I could do to get to study with him. That's the reason. But it was kind of ironic that as I was mentioning, lived on Long Island, and it was in April. I remember, I uh, I had heard that Longley was going to play a recital at St. Thomas Church, so I thought, oh, I think I'd like to go to that, and so I went and I met Longley, and I heard him play, and I liked his playing, and he said he always remembered me because he remembered my voice. He remembered because he was blind. He knew he was very sensitive to the sound of people's voices. And I told him I had played one of his pieces called Miniature on my graduate recital. And um, but I wasn't planning on studying with him. I was planning on studying with Andre Marchal, which I did. And But then, I didn't just study with Andre Marchal at Langlais, but I also studied with Suzanne Chose-Martin and Marcel Dupré. There were these wonderful teachers, and you learn different things from each of those teachers.
Tell me. Oh, that's what I would love to hear.
I wanted to study um, I wanted to study improvisation. And Marshall, although he improvised very beautifully himself, he did not teach it. And so he gave permission. And you have to remember, in France in those days, when you study with a teacher, it's sort of like they owned you. You didn't, uh, you didn't study with somebody else. You study with that teacher. So he quote gave permission for me to study with Langlais, to study improvisation with him. And so that's how it started.
So how how did Langlais teach you improvisation? Give me some nitty-gritty about how that uh, teaching process proceeded.
Well, there are two places where I studied it with him. In his home on the Vassis Lulula. He had a little Spenkadel, German organ in his little studio, and then of course at Sacramento, which was marvelous to get to play on that organ. But actually, where I really studied it was at the Schola Cantorum. Were in the I was in a class with 10 other students, and he taught. It was a group lesson. He taught each of us. I always remember there was one lady, one French, Monique Becheras, who, I think people said that he could even make stones improvise. He just had this ability to help to permit you to do it. And I think that's really what I learned about teaching, that you, first of all, you believe in the person. You believe that they can do it. And then you start with very simple things and you let them everybody has this ability within them, but it's a question of finding a way to bring that out. And that's what Longblade was so good at. And that's what I'll be eternally grateful to him for that.
So in one of those classes, if I had gone there, what would I have seen? What would have happened?
Well, he would give he usually he gave a themes based on Gregorian chant. And I knew zero about Gregorian chant at that time. So, that was a great learning experience for me. So, he would dictate a theme and you would write it down. And that's what you improvised on. And improvising on modal themes was a lot easier than improvising, say, on hymn tunes, because modality is it's freer in terms rhythmically freer and in terms of the things that you can do with it.
Would you say there was a step by step progression of skills he was building, or it was more a global approach?
I would say it was a more global approach.
Uh-huh.
And you didn't know what he was well, I mean, he started well, it was what he called the Gregorian paraphrase. So it's there again because you're dealing with Gregorian chant. And you would do something very simple with that theme. And these are the things, that he had learned from Tournemire, and from Franck. It's all sort of this whole tradition that he imparted to us.
So when you now, having had all this tremendous experience, encounter a student and you want them to improvise on a, a Gregorian chant, what do you say to them, and what happens in that lesson? Like right now, I'm in the classroom with you, and you're going to say, Linda, take a deep breath. You're going to improvise. So tell me more what you're going to be
Well,
saying to me.
when I teach it, I mean, I've, you know, changed over the years. I can remember one student with absolutely no talent, just they couldn't do it. And then I remember, I think it was at one AGO convention, and I was talking about, oh, there was this student who was so untalented, and then I had some of my students were there. She said, she's talking about me. And I was like, said, no, 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 no. It was someone who wasn't there anymore. But what I learned to do, I mean, people don't know chant very well. And so I took an approach of you have to reach their emotional state. So I learned to have them express different emotions. Don't don't base it on any chant. Just express a feeling. Express something of sadness. And you see, so if you take away all of the rules, it's possible. What see, Dupre was very strict about teaching, the Thème libre, for example, was a very strict form uh, that, you know, I remember after I had had some lessons with Dupre, uh, he said, "Well, I think you can study with my assistant, Roland Palfinelli." So I remember going to her apartment. She had a little electronic organ in her apartment, and so she gave me a theme. It was the Thème libre theme, and so I thought, oh, a free theme, how nice. I started to improvise, harmonize the theme, and then went and she said, "Oh no, 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 no." I said, "Oh, I did something wrong already." So you see that was a very strict form, which actually dates back to the time of Franck. Uh, so she said, "Well, I think that, you could go to the École Normale and study with Suzanne Chesmartin." I said, "Okay." So that's how that happened. And Suzanne Chesmartin was a wonderful teacher. So I was grateful for that. So, you see there was not just one teacher, but there were so many different teachers that I got something from each one of them that was different.
And for you as a pedagogue, how has your teaching evolved? You've said you've learned so much from your students. Look at the Ann Labounsky who started at Duquesne and the one who is teaching today. What difference would we see looking across that? What did she learn?
Well, I think that I learned in 56 years. First of all, I should tell you, Linda, when we moved to Pittsburgh, we moved here because to work at the Brentwood Presbyterian Church. My husband was the choir director and I was the organist. I had no I had no desire particularly or plan to teach in a university. And then after a couple of years, I had a phone call and the man said, "Would you like to teach at Duquesne?" And I said, "I guess so. What's Duquesne?" I'd never heard of Duquesne. I always laugh about that. Uh, so, how would you like to teach at a university? I thought, well, why not? Yeah, I could try. And so that's how it happened. I had two students that I started with, and I didn't know what I was doing. David Craig had said the same thing when he started to teach. But there again, I think you learn how to do it by trial and error.
What are some of the things you learn? Like if you were giving me advice if I were a teacher, an organ teacher, what's some advice you would tell me so that I could avoid some of the mistakes you made as a young teacher?
Oh, oh no. Just find are you talking about literature or improvisation or both?
Globally, yeah. So anything and everything that would be wisdom that that's accrued over your teaching career.
Just well, you find out from the student what do they need? Are they have a lot of times they have to play in a church, so you teach what the things that they need, and you try to teach them how to play hymns. Hymn playing is some of the most difficult things that an organist can do. People don't say that, but I know that's true. There aren't very many. Well, Fred Swan was a wonderful. We know that when he was at Riverside, and then when he was out at the Crystal Cathedral, he was a very good uh, hymn player.
Mm.
Uh, but how to do that is not easy. So I'd start with whatever the hymnal was, and I'd say, well, start by reading the words to the hymn, and then sing it, and then you play the hymn in the way that you would sing it. Because if a lot of times people don't breathe, and they don't breathe enough in between the stanzas of a hymn. I've graded a lot of AGO exams, and so it's like, I know I'm gonna write that.
Breathe between the stanzas.
Yeah.
So, just to wrap up, I wanted to ask you one question. Ask you to complete my sentence, okay? When a student graduates and leaves my studio, I hope that I will have been able to help them to
Find a good job.
great. That
Find
is
a job.
find a job. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. That is
I do I've done that all along. Because that's the great pleasure. You find, okay, that, the pastors will call and say, I need an organist. That's what they always say. I need an organist, just to produce one right now. And so, I try to help them. I try to place the organists in the various positions, whatever they can do.
That's marvelous. So, I want to thank you, Ann Labounsky, for talking with me.
It's like,
And for your lifelong artistry that we've all enjoyed, and for creating generations of young organists. We're grateful.
or not even just necessarily young, but I will take them at any age because I believe that you don't have to start at 15 the way I did. I mean, as someone I've had all different. I remember a nun once. She was wearing the full habit. This is a funny story. I think it was in the summer, and I just touched her, her arm. I was trying to help her, not press the keys so hard. And she jumped. And she said, "Oh, you touched me." I said, "Oh, I'm sorry." I was thinking, well, that's one isolated example. I've had young students, I've had, elderly students, all ages. It's not just young students.
That is good for all of us to know.
It's never too late
Thank
to
you.
start. I should tell you one thing. When I took as a teacher, one of the things that I felt I needed to do, I served on HEO Council, National Council. And one of the things that I felt I needed to do was set an example of. So became fully certified, took all the exams. And when I passed the FAGO, I got one letter, just congratulating me. And you know who it was from?
Fred Swan.
It was. He was such a gentleman.
So I loved Fred Swan. I sang with him when I was young at Riverside, and I I could have fallen for him in a minute. I mean, oh, he just had a radiant
He did.
personality.
He did. I remember I took one lesson from him after my freshman year. I went into the city and had a lesson with him at Riverside. And he was, just very nice. And
I have to tell you about my audition story with Fred. So I made an appointment to audition for him, and I had just graduated from college. I'd never sung with a professional choir. I'd sung with my college choir, right?
yeah.
And um, so I made an appointment, and I at Riverside, you'd have to go up an elevator to reach his office, which may be on the third floor. And I remember going up that elevator and standing outside his door, with his brother. And I said, "Linda, what are you doing? This is absolutely preposterous. You have no reason to be here singing for Frederick Swan." So I went back down on the elevator, out on the street, on whatever street that was. But then, and I was a good Presbyterian, and my mother had taught me properly. So I got back up on the elevator, and I thought I can at least apologize to him and thank him for his time. So I get there, and then he says, "Oh, come on, let's just sing something." So I had brought this little Brahms song, Sontag. So he puts it down and he starts to play. It has maybe a 4-bar introduction. And I said, it was already just been the 4 bars of introduction, like being whisked away on a magic carpet.
Yeah.
And I sang because, I had never, ever sung with a great musician before. So there you are. Suddenly, it's like, oh, I'm in heaven. This is,
Yeah.
and
It was if you weren't nervous or anything.
well, it was so transforming. I wasn't nervous.
when you met Lewis? He knew more about sacred music.
He don't miss him so much. He he came from a Presbyterian family in Nashville, and his mother wanted him to become a Presbyterian pastor, and he went to Davidson College, and he realized that he wasn't a Presbyterian. So that was, and he realized that he didn't want to become an ordained preacher, although he was a very good preacher. I mean, his father had insisted that both his brother was a Presbyterian minister. His father insisted that they take public speaking because he knew how important it was for them to be able to express themselves in a coherent way. And so both of them, could speak really well. Lewis did go for, after he graduated from Davidson, he went to Richmond Theological Seminary. That's when he realized he discovered that he really wasn't a Presbyterian. And then he went to the University of Michigan. That's where I met him. And because he thought he would like to get a master's in sacred music. And then after he met me, he decided he didn't need to play the organ. And but he was a history uh, and theology major. So this man knew, well, he knew all the things that I didn't know. So isn't that wonderful?
Yeah.
You meet somebody who's the other half who has all the things that you don't have.
Well, I think you also he was very extroverted, and when he was in the room, you knew it, right?
Yeah.
Lewis filled the room. I mean, he had a large voice,
He had, yeah.
and his laughter would just fill the whole house. You could hear him laughing, right, Ann?
Right.
And Ann, I think, is much more modest, demure, kind of person. So they were complementary
Definitely, yeah.
way too. In
He knew all the things that I didn't know.
well, he didn't play the organs.
That's it. So that was a really wonderful way. And well, and then here's the funny thing. So it was hard in the beginning because see, his father had a construction company, and he wanted Lewis to take over the company, but I did not want to live in Nashville. And so, we finally decided no. So then he moved to New York. So he had to find a job. And so what he did was he spent the first 2 weeks doing nothing but riding the subway. At that time, the subway tokens were a lot cheaper. So, he was very methodical. So he bought, all of these subway tokens, and he mastered the New York subway system. And so then he got a job with the Geico Insurance Company in the ground floor of the Empire State Building. What was so funny was that his boss was Brian Dugan, a guy from Brooklyn, who knew how to get from Brooklyn to the Empire State Building. But Lewis, with his very thick Southern accent, he knew all of the subway system, and he knew where everything was. And so he would be brought, he'd say, "Hey, Lewis, tell these people where they should go."
Well, how did Lewis move from this world to um Connolly Steele?
Okay, that's another funny story. So then he worked for Geico Insurance Company, and I was paying the bills. But there was one problem with that. I didn't know how to balance a checkbook. And so, when there was a bill that would come in, I'd write the check. But if you wrote a check for more than what you had in the bank, you just borrowed another $500. And then when Lewis realized what had happened, he said, we can't afford to live on Long Island anymore. So then we started looking for jobs. And this is how things just, are providential, how they work out. But when he was at Davidson, he had studied with Bob Lord. It was Robert Sutherland Lord, this, he had also studied with Langlais, but Lewis had studied with him at Davidson, and I think he let Lord know that we were looking for jobs, and so we had put our furniture in storage. It was like the 11th hour. We had applied for different church jobs, and nothing had come through yet. And so we were going to go to Nashville, and we got this call from Kenneth Gates from the Brentwood Presbyterian Church. Would we like to audition there? And so we said sure. So that's how it was that we moved to Pittsburgh.
I didn't realize that Robert Sutherland Lord had been at Davidson.
Yes.
And when we lived in Chapel Hill, do you know the name of Van Quinn Wiley's?
Yes. Yes.
Well, we were with him all 8 years. We were in
Oh, yes.
there, and I established a children's choir there and directed it. I mean, it worked very closely with him. And when we moved out of that house, Van Quinn came to our house, and that day the moving truck was there, and he said, "If I would lie down in front of the moving truck, it wouldn't stop them probably from making you move away, would it?" I mean, I'm just saying, we were really, really close. Now, I didn't realize that until you just said that now, that Robert Sutherland Lord, I knew Robert Sutherland Lord had been his teacher, but I didn't put that together that that there was also a Lewis connection. So I'm saying, that's what heaven will be like. It's when we will get all of the connections that we haven't seen
Right.
here. We missed them here. All of the people working in the background make things happen in your life that you didn't know was going on. But that's now you'll know, even also as you are known.
That's it.
That's
Yeah.
I get it
Yeah.
now. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was really funny. So then I'm at Duquesne teaching, learning how to teach because I didn't know how to teach. And Langlais had said, um, he said, put on tez for your thesis. I thought, really? What's the? And so then I knew to be hired. Well, I mean, I was hired full time because the dean who hired me said you have a choice. I can hire you as a full time professor, as the lowest rank, or you can be a part time teacher. And I said, well, I would like to be full time. And so it was a tenure track. And in order to, climb up the academic ladder, you had to have a doctorate degree. And so, okay. Actually, that was one of the very good things that had happened. So then, all right, well, I guess it'll be at Pitt. And Robert Lord was teaching there, and Don Franklin. And so I enrolled, and I learned so much from both of those. But I had an advantage because I knew French. Well, here's how it happened for me. My Aunt Julia had studied in France. She studied art, and she lived in New York on East 60th Street. And so she would come out to Long Island every weekend. And she decided when I was 10 years old, she decided I would learn French, that she would teach me. So she started, and she's the one who gave me there's just a real love for the language, the culture, the history. And it was because of her, all of these things